Okay, I think we're live.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Hopefully everybody's tuning in right now. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And so excited about this show because we are joined by Rania Masri. Rania is a Lebanese-American part-time professor of freelance part-time professor of Communications and Environmental Justice, and she was trained in environmental studies and also taught that. She is also a peace activist, a media critic, and a member of the Lebanese political party Citizens in the States. And we're going to be talking about, this is an All Things Lebanon edition. And I'm very excited about it because I've been wanting to do this topic for a long time, but trying to get guests on the show to come here and talk about it. And Rania has agreed to do it. So Rania, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today.
A pleasure. Thank you so much, Yuri, for this space. And, it'll be fun.
Well, it's, like I said many times off the air, it's a real honor to have you. I'm so excited to have you on. And all right, so folks, if you are tuning in, we are going to be doing a Q&A after I'm done formally interviewing Rania. So, but before we get into that, let's start this interview. So, Rania, my first question I'd like to ask. Excuse me? Oh, 1 second. Oh, hold up. You're muted, Rania. You're muted right now. Oh, wait 1 sec. Can't it says that your mic isn't connected right now.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect. Okay. Well.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Okay. So Rania. So my first question is when one talks of Lebanon, they often skip when the French colonized Lebanon, and I don't want to go too much into French colonialism in Lebanon, but can you talk about at least what it was like when the French colonized Lebanon, and are some of the roots of the ongoing crisis Lebanon face rooted in French colonialism? Oh, 1 sec, I can't hear you again. Oh, wait, 1 moment. At the moment, can't hear you still. Okay, speak now, Rania. Uh-oh. Okay, speak now, Rania. Oh, wait, what's going on? Yeah, still can't hear you. Yeah, still can't hear you for the moment. Hold on. Stand by, folks. We're just having some technical problems, but we're going to try to sort it out. Hold on. Oh, yeah. Wait a minute. Oh, you also can't hear me right now. Okay, yeah. All right. Folks, please stand by. Me and Rania, we're going to try to fix whatever seems to be the problem. Okay. Wow, that's weird. So apparently Rania is having a hard time hearing me as well. Oof, jeez, what could... Okay, okay, Rania says that she's going to leave and try coming back. Okay, we'll try to do that. Hopefully, and hopefully it'll work.
Okay, it worked. It worked. I'm back. I'm back.
Perfect.
Okay. I'm so sorry for that. I'm so sorry. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yes.
Yes.
All right, so folks, yes, please don't leave. Come join us. Okay, so basically, Rania, briefly, if you can, just talk about what it was like when the French colonized the Lebanese, and are some of the roots of Lebanon's problems. Can you trace that back to French colonialism? That's my first question.
Yes, fantastic question. And I very much appreciated that you're using the term French colonialism, because all too often the term that's used is French mandate, the kindness of the French, or even what some fellow Lebanese refer to as Mother France, the compassionate Mother France. Because, of course, Mother France came to the region and built this amazing political system out of the kindness of its heart, and gave us our borders, and bless our mother for taking care of us ever since. So, of course, I don't subscribe to that perspective, and I very much view what the French did as traditional, old-fashioned colonialism. So the French came by at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the French and the British started, dividing up the region, similar to how other countries divided up Africa, how other countries divided up Latin America. And the French took what is now considered Lebanon and Syria, but of course at that time there was no present-day borders of Lebanon. Lebanon was a completely different, geographical makeup than it was now. And the French came by from 1923, and they stayed until 1946, and they did two things that we're still paying for until today. Okay, so they constructed our national borders in Lebanon, not according to any geographical design, not because there's a mountain or there's a lake, but solely to have a particular kind of sectarian demographic. So solely to create a majority Maronite Christian population in Lebanon. They constructed the borders that we have, and they did that construction specifically so that they can design a sectarian system of government. Now, what do I mean by a sectarian system of government? That means, in contrast to what the French have, liberty, fraternity, equality, in contrast to what the US system is, which is one person, one vote, no, what we have in Lebanon, because of the French, is a system in which we are not treated as Lebanese citizens, but we are treated as individuals within a sectarian community into which we were born. And depending on the size of that sectarian community into which we were born, which we have no choice in, we then get particular placements in public office, depending on the size, and in all positions of public office. And so then they came up with this, they called it a consociational democracy. The United States has since touted this as the best political system in the world when you're dealing with so many different communities. So the mere idea that religious, the way that you and I might choose to worship God, would then be defined as a community becomes in and of itself problematic, and actually denies us the very concept of a community. Because what defines a community is not how I choose to worship God. What defines who you and I are our politics, our education, our employment, our residence, so on and so forth, but not, when or where we choose to fast. So by constructing that political sectarian system that the French gave us, they then denied us equal citizenship. They then created a system that can only, by design, can only breed corruption, can only breed clientelism, and can only breed national impotence. Because we do not have leaders that represent a country. We have leaders that represent this false idea of community. So this is the first thing that the French did, and that, the Americans and the British have continued to support them. My apologies for saying Americans, I mean the United States, and of course not the entire continent from Canada to Argentina.
Although I'm pretty sure Canada also plays a negative role.
Canada plays a role in that, but the Argentinians in this are innocent. Okay, so they did that, but they also did something else, which we're also paying the price of right now, which was something that I personally didn't even know about until I read this brilliant book by Hisham Safieddine, who's a professor in Oxford. And the book is called Banking on the State, The Financial Foundations of Lebanon. And in that book, he traces what the French did for our economic system. And he says that the French financial complicity in Lebanon is as old as Lebanon itself. That since 1919, the French have been influencing the Lebanese economic system because the French did several things. They pegged what was at that time the Lebanese and Syrian bank. They pegged that currency to the French currency. They encouraged a great deal of privatization in Lebanon. And they encouraged a system in Lebanon in which we would be importing French products with no kind of protection for Lebanese products.
And this during colonialism, or this is afterwards. This is after even the French gave Lebanon independence, right?
This is before the French gave Lebanon independence. They tied the Syrian and the Lebanese lira to the French franc at a rate favorable to French imports. They created major concessions in agriculture and industry and financial services to French firms to the detriment of the local development in Lebanon and in Syria. Okay, so that when the French had a financial crisis, the Lebanese felt it. When the Lebanese then got the official political independence in 1943, that did not end French financial control. They continued to monopolize the monetary policy in Lebanon until 1964, and then have continued to influence Lebanese economic policy through their massive loans, no gifts, no financial gifts, their massive loans that have all pushed and stipulated for privatization of national assets in Lebanon. And they have also stipulated for a great deal of foreign influence in the Lebanese economy as well as in the Lebanese politics. So both of these things we are suffering from today because of the French. We are suffering from a political sectarian system that breeds incompetence and creates inequality and leads to the level of economic destruction that we have now. And the French also gave us and encouraged us to have an extremely destructive economic system that does not support local investment, that does not support local production, but that actually is built on loans and on debts and pegs itself to a foreign currency.
Interesting. And I think that's a perfect segue then to you already answered how France still plays a very regressive role in the Lebanese affair. So that's a perfect segue then to this question. So what was the Lebanese Civil War? Why did it break out? And how did Israel's oppression of Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, why did that bleed into Lebanon's civil war? And then if you can also talk about why Syria was involved and why Syria was in Lebanon for so long after the civil war. But yeah.
Okay, that's a lot that you're throwing in there. I'll start with the easy one, which is okay. If we want to look at the Lebanese Civil War officially, it says that the Lebanese Civil War began in 1975 and ended in 1991. These are the official dates. Although many of us would argue it began way before, and many of us would argue it's still continuing. What's important, I think, for this conversation is to realize that some in Lebanon call it the war of others in Lebanon. Literally, this is what they call it. That it wasn't a civil war, that Lebanon was a playground for foreigners, and they all got invested, and they all participated in the civil war, and we were all victims of the foreign intervention. Of course, foreigners had a lot to do with the Lebanese Civil War. There's no question about that. But Lebanese also had a lot to do with the Lebanese Civil War. And within this perspective of what was the Lebanese responsibility for the Civil War, there's again different perspectives. There's one which is, forgive me, the role of the poverty that had dramatically increased in the years preceding to the Civil War, which again were natural consequences of the lack of local development and the lack of local protection economically. But there was also multiple sectarian political parties in the country that had differing perspective as to what Lebanon should be. And here again, we go back to, how do you define yourself? Are you a leftist political party, a right-wing political party, a neoliberal, so on and so forth, but you're still a national political party? Or are you a political party only for a segment of the population, and therefore you view others in the country as other, therefore as threatening, therefore as separate? So we had these perspectives within Lebanon, but most definitely going back to your second question, which is, what is the role of Israel? So Israel here, and it's important for us to realize, Israel is not an occupation force. France had occupied Lebanon, but Israel did not occupy Palestine. The Zionist movement has been colonizing Palestine, and there's a world of difference. When you occupy, you seek to control a land space, you seek to control a people, you seek to control a political system. But when you colonize, you seek to remove the indigenous population from that landscape, similar to what the Europeans did when they colonized the Americas. That was a colonization. I think we need to see the Zionist movement for what it really is, which is a colonization that began way before the establishment of the State of Israel on the land of Palestine in 1948. But going back to Lebanon, we cannot separate what happened in Lebanon from the colonization of Palestine, which is an ongoing colonization. And here I just want to quote Ben Gurion, one of the leading Israeli leaders, who said, and I quote, he had a dream to annex southern Lebanon to, quote, the Jewish state, and to establish a Christian state north of the Litani River. So his dream was to establish a Christian state in Lebanon. And we see from that time, from the time of Ben Gurion until present day, that there has been direct involvement of Zionist leaders into Lebanese politics to create sectarian statelets in Lebanon, similar to what the Zionist movement has been trying to create otherwise. So we see that for the Zionist movement, for the state of Israel to legitimize itself as a quote unquote Jewish state, it would need to be surrounded by other religious entities, because it would give itself a reason for being. So if it were surrounded by civil states, ones where we are treated equally under law, where we are equal citizens, that would be a threat to Zionism. But if it were surrounded by a Christian state here, a Muslim state there, Alawis here, Druze there, so on and so forth, it would give itself raison d'être to continue to exist as a Jewish state. Once we recognize that in Lebanon, therefore, if we want to exist as a state, we can only be a civil state, because we have seen from 1946 onwards what a sectarian state results in Lebanon, which is it results in economic collapse, it results in national destruction, it results in an explosion of our ports. All of these are consequences of that political system. Okay, so if we want to exist as a state, a viable state with a viable economy, we have to be a civil state. If we recognize that, then we also recognize that Israel, so long as it maintains its political system as a Zionist political system, which is a settler state, expansionist, colonialist, racist ideology, therefore, Israel will continue to be an enemy to the state of Lebanon, and we will continue to be an enemy to the state of Israel, vice versa. So once we understand all of that, then we see, okay, how Israel has influenced Lebanon in the civil wars, in its occupation. Yeah. The first Israeli massacre against Lebanese was in 1948. And the Israeli army and the Zionists have continued to attack Lebanon almost consistently from 1948 until 2006, regularly. Massacre after massacre, invasion after invasion, occupation after occupation, until 2006. From 2006 until now, we've had regular incursions into our airspace, into our water space, into our land space. Every now and then, the Israeli army goes into Lebanese lands and actually kidnaps a shepherd and then releases him a few days later. So we still have those infractions. But I think what's critical for people to understand is, even if Israel were to stop invading Lebanese airspace, even if they were to stop occupying Lebanese lands, because they still occupy a portion of Lebanese lands, even if they were to stop doing all that, the fact that they continue to exist within their racist ideology makes them a threat to the existence of Lebanon as a civil state. So that's my long answer for that.
Well, actually, then a follow-up then is so obviously, if we go back to the first question,
Yes.
the sort of sectarian caste system which the French imposed on Lebanon, and which still and which they left in place in Lebanon. Yes. That plays into why eventually a civil war broke out. But when we talk about Israel's involvement in the Lebanese Civil War, it's not because of a few Palestinian refugees or the PLO were shooting rockets at Israel, and therefore Israel had to defend itself by invading Lebanon. No, Israel played a partner in crime to Western imperialism in Lebanon, and Israel, because of I think they call it the Greater Israel Project. Yeah. So Israel has this Greater Israel Project in which it's not just about wiping off the indigenous Palestinians, but expanding the state of Israel into Lebanon, and that's why Israel supported the sort of right-wing factions in the Lebanese Civil War, which led to the Sabra and Shatila massacre, right?
Well, I mean, let's quote the Israelis themselves. The Israelis are very transparent in their memoirs. They're very transparent in their statements. And we have here a statement by Moshe Dayan himself, who was the Israeli chief of staff in the early 1950s. And it was in his view, and he said, all we need to do is to find a Christian Lebanese officer, perhaps no higher than a captain, and win him over or buy him with money so that he would declare himself the savior of the Maronite population. Then the Israeli army would enter Lebanon, occupy the territory in question, and establish a Christian government which would form an alliance with Israel. This was back in 1949 were these statements. Okay, the early 1950s, late 1940s were these statements. And this was exactly what Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon did in 1982. This was exactly what they did. So we can go back to what the Israelis have stated was their plan in Lebanon from the 1940s. We can go back to see how the Israelis, who they've been supporting in Syria. We can see what they have done in northern Iraq. They're extraordinarily transparent with supporting divisions wherever they go, with supporting sectarianism wherever they go, and with supporting really problematic individuals. And all of this is natural when you look at their ideology, which is an ideology of supremacy. It's an ideology of apartheid. It's an ideology of colonialism. So, of course, it's natural that they would create such allies and develop these allies. And what is essential for us to understand, and if you notice, all of this is irrespective of what we think about Palestine, by the way. All of this is irrespective of the so-called Palestinian question, okay? If we want to be, as a people, sovereign and free and proud and dignified, we cannot in any way build alliances with leaders that are in and of themselves built on supremacist ideologies, built on colonialism, built on destruction, because they will also use us. Not only will we be giving up our conscience, but we would also be giving up our sovereignty.
That's very fascinating. In fact, I got the chance to interview Miko Peled. I had met him twice. I met him twice in person, once at a Palestine solidarity event, and another time at the last Labour Party conference when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. And because I had heard Max Blumenthal a couple of times mention that Israel doesn't just do imperialism, colonialism in Palestine itself, but that Israel was actually a partner in crime to the American, Canadian, Anglo Empire in Latin America. And then I thought, really, that's true. And then I saw that Israel actually was supporting, the attempted coup in Venezuela and so forth. So I thought to myself, okay, so that whole idea that oh no, Israel is just mean to the Palestinians. No, that's actually bullshit. No, Israel actually helps Western imperialism, and Miko Peled was was saying to me that Israel actually supported the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba. I know that Israel supports Paul Kagame. So going back to Lebanon, he basically was explaining to me that did not have anything to do with Yasser Arafat
Yeah.
and so forth going into refugee camps and firing rockets into Israel. No, Israel was actually involved in factions in the Lebanese Civil War, and that's basically why we have an organization like Hezbollah, right?
Yes, it's a bit more complicated as to how we then got to Hezbollah, but I think we need to look at Israel as an imperialist satellite in the region, an imperialist satellite that was created by the European, successive Western European governments, by successive United States governments to continue military and economic influence in the region, and we therefore have this satellite imperialist power in Israel. And one thing that I would love to see, and I think it's important for American viewers to realize this, there's a George Floyd trial ongoing right now, the trial for the murder of George Floyd. And one of the questions that I would love the prosecutor to ask is, where did the US Police Department learn this technique of putting their knees over the heads of those who have already been deemed to be of no physical threat? Where did they learn that technique? We have a long, intricate relationship, not only between the US military and the US police departments, but also between the Israeli military and US police departments. And there is only one city in the United States that has deemed it illegal for police in the United States to be trained by Israel, and that's the city of Durham, North Carolina. And we need to have more cities throughout the United States that make this illegal to protect Americans from learning the techniques of the Israeli military. And this is how we build solidarity, by understanding how we're all related, by understanding how the evils of the imperialist powers of Israel or of the United States military or of others really impact all of us around the world. So I just had to throw that in because this ongoing trial of George Floyd. But you brought up Hezbollah, and I think it's critical that you bring up Hezbollah within this front. But it's also important for us to understand resistance to the colonialization of the Israeli state, be it in Palestine or be it the dream that Israel had, which was to colonize further into Lebanon or into Syria, began even before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. People have been rising up, okay? In Lebanon, of course, people were rising up. So the very first, for example, suicide mission in Lebanon was not led by anyone who believed in the afterlife or by anyone who believed in heaven, but rather was led by individuals within the Communist Party and individuals within the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, none of whom had discourse of the afterlife, but all of whom had discourse of responsibility to one's people and one's land. So within that background, we can then understand, okay, what is Hezbollah and how did Hezbollah come to be? And Hezbollah is the most successful resistance movement in Lebanon, if not in the region, if not possibly in the world. There's no question to their military prowess. There's no question to their success. There's no question to their devotion and sacrifice to the liberation of most of the Lebanese lands. They were founded in the midst of the Israeli occupation of the South. They were not the first to resist, but they were the most organized to resist. And we can talk at length as to those reasons, which are both internal and international. Yeah. After the liberation of most of the South in May 2000, and after the victory, the military victory of the Israeli war against Lebanon in 2006, we then had a massive transformation of this party, though. So here we do have Hezbollah as an amazing military prowess, a military prowess that had to be born because of the absence of the state in defending its own land, because of the absence of the Lebanese army having the ability to defend its own land, because it was by design that the Lebanese army could not defend its own land, because they were denied even the political space and the military arms to defend their own land. So we go back to the very sectarian system itself. So now we are at this stage right now where we have a country that is economically bankrupt, a country that has never been as broken as we are today. Never. In the midst of the Civil War, with all of the other occupations that we faced, never did we face the threat that we are facing today, where we are a country that is bankrupt. What does this mean to be bankrupt? Lebanon is a country that imports more than 80% of its needs. For us to be bankrupt means we may not be able to import what we need. We need medicine. We import around $1.2 billion a year in medicines. What are we going to do then? We need fuel to run our electricity. We import more than $3 billion worth of fuel every year. What are we going to do then? We import all our foods. We are not food sufficient. We are not food secure. What do we do then? So here it is a real threat to the very existence of a people when you have a country that is built on import by design, of course, because that was part of the economic design, that we become import-based and rentier-based and a consumptive economy. Now we are bankrupt, and where do we go from here? And what do we do now? And here I put all the political parties in Lebanon responsible, all of them, including Hezbollah, but not only Hezbollah, because all of them had plenty of an opportunity from the early 1990s until today to develop a different economic system, to actually invest in local infrastructure, to protect our youth from having to migrate and leave the country in order to get a job. But we're at this tremendously scary stage right now in our country.
Before I ask about Rafiq Hariri and the economic policies he implemented, so can I just say this one thing then about about Hezbollah, because I went to schools with big Israeli communities. I have friends from Israel, many of them very much ultra Zionist, very much of a Netanyahu or whatever persuasion, and a lot of times they would say, okay, Yuri, the reason why we had to attack Lebanon is because look, Hezbollah kidnapped one of our soldiers, and the Lebanese government doesn't do anything to stop Hezbollah's harassment. They never did anything to stop the Palestinians firing rockets. Therefore, we had to invade. But what you're explaining to me is that if you actually look at what at what the Israeli state wants, which is a greater Israel, and the fact that Lebanon was built on this ridiculous sectarianism, which the French did. Even if the Lebanese state wanted to stop, whatever scuffles that goes on between the Palestinian diaspora or Hezbollah, they couldn't, even if they wanted to, because the system was built so that they are so weak, so that the West can continue to take advantage of Lebanon, and that Israel, which is a partner in crime to Western imperialism, can continue to, I
wouldn't go so far as to say they couldn't if they wanted to, because they very much could if they wanted to. But I also want to go back a bit, if I could. When we talk about Palestinian armed resistance, Palestinians have the right legally to defend themselves in the manner that they choose. Even if they were to lobby rockets from Lebanon into their occupied villages in northern Palestine and what is considered the state of Israel, they have the legal right to do so. And I will defend Palestinian armed resistance unequivocally. We can talk about it strategically, but morally, ethically, legally, I am on their side. Okay, and I think that's critical, is to understand this within the context that it is. And the same as we can look at armed resistance in Lebanon. I mean, Israel was an occupying force in Lebanon from 1978 to 2000. The Lebanese had and continue to have the right to armed resistance against that occupation. No matter who, that is their right, that is their legal right, that is their ethical right. And I would also go so far as to say that is their national duty. Our national duty to liberate our lands, as we believe that everyone should live free and sovereign. So yet they can live free and sovereign as colonizers in other people's homes, literally in other people's homes. But yet when we choose to defend ourselves against them, then we are regarded as the aggressor. No. Okay. Of course, though, that is the same mythology that we see all around us. And I would encourage all your listeners to watch the brilliant Exterminate the Brutes that is right now being shown, so that we can also reevaluate the legacies of colonialism and white supremacy that have been brought to us all courtesy of the Europeans, and that, of course, the Israelis are manifesting. So just to understand all that. Yeah. But when we look at Lebanon, I feel extremely uncomfortable to state that we are unable. And I also find that to be ahistoric and apolitical and incorrect. There are foreign influences in Lebanon, no question, but that does not mean that we as Lebanese are unable to build a state, or unable to build a sovereign army, or unable to take these chances. We are able. We are able. And perhaps one of the things that we as colonized peoples need to understand is we need to remember what Frantz Fanon told us, that the pathway to liberation, here's my paraphrase for the great Frantz Fanon, I'm not quoting him directly, but the pathway to liberation must begin in decolonizing our minds. So it must begin by recognizing, yes, we are able, yes, we do have the imagination to think about a different system, and yes, we do have the capabilities to build that different system. And this is where we go right now in Lebanon. I mean, who would have thought that a people that was not supported by an army could defeat, not once, not twice, but several times over, the largest, most financed, most supported military in the region, which is the Israeli military. But we did it. We, the Lebanese people, did it. We liberated our lands in the south. We liberated our capital in Beirut, and we were able to defeat any military objectives of the Israelis in 2006. So once we recognize that power, then yes, we can also then build a civil state. We can also dismantle the sectarian political system. We can also come up with a different economic system. We have to start by recognizing we have the capabilities to do so. And our first challenge is our imagination. And then we can determine the pathway to do that building. But I have to say that we are able to do so. And our Lebanese army is able to build its prowess to defend our country, just as Lebanese politicians do have the ability to defend our country. Not the current ones, though. Not the current ones. Because so long as they hold on to a sectarian system, then they cannot have that ability. But once they let go of the sectarian system and develop a civil system, develop a national system, then most definitely we will have that ability. There's no question in mind.
That is a perfect segue then to that's a perfect segue then to now, when did the Lebanese Civil War end? Let's talk about Rafik Hariri, because when the Civil War ended, someone credited with bringing peace and prosperity to Lebanon was Rafik Hariri, who was twice prime minister of your country in the early 90s and the early 2000s. He was the father of Saad Hariri, the former ousted prime minister of Lebanon, and he was lionized in the West when he was murdered. So my question is, what role did the economics he implemented in Lebanon lead to the current crisis you've been describing to us?
I mean, it's very important to understand Rafik al-Hariri was a businessman. He was a businessman brought in from Saudi Arabia. He was not even a local businessman. He was a billionaire who then quadrupled his wealth as prime minister. I mean, there's so many similarities to this in the United States. I'll leave your listeners to make up their own comparisons.
Yeah.
But here he came in the early 90s. He brought with him Riyad Salami, who he imposed as the governor of the central bank and who remains the governor of the central bank in Lebanon. And we can talk at length about the doings and financial engineering.
Wait. So, sorry to interrupt. What was his business background when he was in Saudi Arabia before he came to Lebanon?
Very closely affiliated with the Saudi monarchy. And so therefore doing the construction or whatever business that they wanted done and getting hefty commissions consequently. But yes, definitely a friend of the Saudi monarchy, who came in with that mindset, came in with the mindset of a businessman, to increase his own business, not to build the economic wealth of the country. So from 1992 to 1997, he, along with the support, and I think this is essential for people to recognize, along with the support of each and every sectarian political party in government at that time, he developed financial engineering within the country of a loan system from private banks, massively supported by the central bank, where the private banks were actually making money off the taxpayers, equivalent dollars. And then from 1997, he, again, along with all the other sectarian political parties, did what really should be considered a crime economically, which is they started borrowing in hard currency. So they started borrowing not from our local banks, but they started borrowing from foreign banks. They did this in 97, in 2002, in 2007, in 2012, and 2016. Okay, so then becomes the question, okay, if we borrowed so extensively, what did we do with all that money? We had, during this time period, around $350 billion come into Lebanon. Let me be very specific with the numbers. No, sorry, $250 billion come into Lebanon from the time period of 1992 to 2019. 250 billion coming into that, in just basically 2 decades for a population of 7 million is a great deal of money. Okay, so then that boils down to, what did we do with the money? And if we recognize here, during this time period, we had all the sectarian political system build an economy made of debt, indebted to foreign currency, indebted to the Europeans and the Americans. Okay, they built an economy built on remittances, because during the same time period, we exported. Our main export in Lebanon was our educated youth. We exported almost half of 2 generations. So you had, between the ages of 20 and 50, almost half of the men and women in that age group left the country. You can just imagine the societal impacts of this. They left the country because there were no jobs, and they brought in dollars to their families to support them. Now, all of this was by design. None of this is coincidental. We also had the rise of universities. We have more than 60 universities in Lebanon. It's an insane number. We have more universities in Lebanon than they have in Germany. Just if you can compare the size. Why? Because we are exporting our youth. We are subsidizing the workforce for the Gulf and for Europe and for the United States. We are exporting our educated class so they can send us remittances. All of this is part of that economic plan that was designed back in the 90s, and I have to say, supported by all the sectarian leaders. It was a plan that was doomed to result in bankruptcy. I mean, when you have a country that imports 80 to 85% of its needs, this is not sustainable. It's a rentier economy. Okay, so it was bound to fail, and it did fail, which is what we saw happen very exquisitely in October 2019, when now we as Lebanese no longer have access to our funds in our banks. Our pensions are lost, our salaries have lost much of their value. Our currency has fallen more than 85%. So, I was telling my brother that now, so myself, I'm a university professor. I make around $300 per class. It's insane. So, while at the same time, so we've lost the value of our wages, but everything in the country has increased dramatically in price. Between 100 to 400% increase in price. We have hyperinflation at the same time as we have a massive devaluation of our currency. And none of this is surprising. All of these are direct consequences of this economic system, which in and of itself, again, was bred by the sectarian system. And Rafi al-Hariri is one of the individuals who is most definitely responsible for it.
So this is probably a stupid joke, but is it safe to say he brought the peace, but he did not bring the prosperity?
Yes, but even I don't think he even brought the peace, because what kind of peace is it when people are so poor and they're forced to leave their countries? When you have more people leave the country after a war than during a war, it speaks a lot about economic violence. And I cannot separate military violence from economic violence. But it also speaks to the exhaustion that people felt. I mean, we had war from 75 to 91. People were willing to accept anything. They were exhausted. So they accepted the warlords themselves who had led the wars. They accepted them to be the politicians. We were so exhausted that we accepted it. And now, what are people saying in Lebanon? That they want a government. They want a government composed of who? The same idiots that led us into this problem to begin with. So when you are so broken, Malcolm X has this brilliant line: if you put a knife 6 inches into my back and you remove it 3 inches, don't expect me to thank you. But when we have a knife that's 6 inches into our back, many of us accept the knife being only removed 3 inches, but the knife is still there.
So, So the question I was going to ask was that basically when the Lebanese Civil War ended, it was basically because everyone was just fed up of fighting. So the war ended, but when it comes to a proper reconciliation, the very leaders who were involved, who were involved in all of this horrendous bloodshed, the Lebanese public were just like, okay, well, we don't really want to we really don't want to reopen those old wounds, so we're just going to accept the leaders as they are, but that still doesn't change the problem in Lebanon, which is the fact that which is the sectarianism, right?
Yes, but I wish it were that simple, because we do not really have the separation between the people and the leadership. It's not as if the sectarian political leaders are like a trifle cake, that they're just the top layer, that if we remove that layer, then everything will be fine. We have to understand that these leaders are also entrenched within society, because it goes back to how we think of them. So if I think of myself as someone born into my sect, and if I think of that sect as my community, and if I accept this perspective that my community has been threatened by your community, and you are out to get me, okay? And then, therefore, the only person who can save me is my sectarian leader, and I'll ignore the fact that I'm just as poor as you are, and we're both unemployed, and we both have no prospects in the country. I just set that aside for a second, okay? Then I'm going to hold on to my sectarian leader, and you're going to hold on to your sectarian leader. And when they make peace, for some reason that we don't know, we're going to accept the peace, but we're going to always keep an eye out, because they may make war again, but we're still going to be beholden to them. So that goes back to decolonizing our minds. If we accept ourselves to be part of these artificial communities, then we can only live within destruction. But once I start to see, no, the way I choose to worship God is an extraordinarily personal aspect that should be no one's business in society. And that's not how I define my community. I am someone who lives in a city. I can define myself as a resident of that city. I am someone who considers my politics to be left of center. I am someone who has a particular national identity. I am a woman who's a feminist. These are all different ways I can identify myself, and they will have repercussions on my politics, but not the sect into which my great-grandfather was born that I am beholden to. No, not that nonsense. But the reason I'm saying that is because we have to understand that these political leaders are entrenched. They have a system that they have bred because of the clientelism that they have supported, because they all, without exception, they all rejected a universal health care. They all rejected strong public education, because once you have universal health care, you don't need to go to your sectarian leader, right? But if you don't have universal health care, you do go to your sectarian leader so he can be the gatekeeper to get you into a hospital. So all of these national institutions were never built or were directly dismantled by the sectarian leaders to maintain their own positioning as leaders of their so-called sect. So it has repercussions that go further, that are not simply an us versus them. If we recognize that as the problem, which many of us in Lebanon do recognize that as the problem, then that becomes the pathway to the solution. So that's why we're saying we don't want a technocratic government in Lebanon. We don't want a government composed of Saad al-Hariri and other people who are similar to him, who continue to look at us as sectarian communities. We want a government composed of courageous, knowledgeable, free individuals who are not beholden to any sect, who are not beholden to any foreign interest, who actually can think about what is best for the country as a whole, and who consequently will recognize healthcare and education as our rights as citizens and not as privileges for some. That's what we need.
I think, thank you very much for answering that. So, okay, this is probably a repetitive question, because I think you kind of, well, I'll just ask it again before we open it up to the audience. So explain the current crisis now in Lebanon, and your political party, and how it would solve the ongoing crisis at home and unite all Lebanese. Right.
Those are big questions. Yeah. Okay, so again, the current crisis that we have right now, it's a consequence of the sectarian political system. It's a consequence of the economic system. So both of these are related, which means, therefore, we need a different political system, and we need a different economic system. And I continue to speak about economics and politics as one, because it's also a fallacy to think that they can be separated. Exactly. Economics is politics par excellence. So we look at them together. So if we recognize those as the problem, then the question becomes, well, what is my political party proposing? So I've been a member of a party called Citizens in a State. In Arabic, مواطنون ومواطنات في دولة. You can find us online, MMFI DAWLA.com.
Yeah, I'm going to make sure to post all of that.
So my party was established around 4.5 years ago with a very simple concept that we can only exist as a civil state. We have to build a democratic, egalitarian, just, and powerful state. And therefore, we are looking at what is happening right now in Lebanon as something that we had expected to happen. It's not something new, okay? And therefore, we do not see that the future is fated. We do not see that that we are doomed. We actually see that we have an opportunity right now. The country is changing. There's no question it is changing. Can we seize hold of the steering wheel and change it in a constructive fashion rather than in a destructive fashion? That becomes the political question. And for us, our proposal to do that change is to develop a transitional government in Lebanon with legislative powers. And this transitional government with legislative powers over a period of 18 months would then be building an economy built on investments and built on production, and not an economy built on consumption for the rich, consumption of the poor by the rich, actually, okay? Mm-hmm. We would build a different kind of electoral system. We would build a different kind of a social system. We would build different kinds of educational systems, so on and so forth. And all of these systems would be built first and foremost on understanding where we currently are in Lebanon, by having a financial census, by having a social census. We haven't had a census of our population since 1923. We have had politicians in Lebanon that are leading by design with ignorance. It is by design that politicians say, I don't know, because knowledge brings responsibility. So we want to develop the knowledge so that we can be able to lead with more responsibility. That is our plan as a political party. And I can speak about it with a lot more detail as to what exactly we want to do in the 18 months. But what becomes very clear for us to recognize is that we see, based on our studies of history, based on our studies of politics, that simply participating in elections is not transformational. It will not result in a new political system. It will not result in a new economic system. It could be fun. I mean, I say this as somebody who did run for parliament in Lebanon several years ago. Say this as somebody who contemplated running for Congress in the United States when I was living in the US. But we also know that electoral politics is electoral politics. It's not transformational. You don't change a system that way. So if we as a political party were to say, we are going to put all our emphasis right now in running for the elections, if they were to happen next year, most likely they won't, okay?
Yeah.
Then the way that we would operate would be different. And then we would know that we get 5 people in parliament, and what do we achieve? A larger megaphone, but no real change. Possibly a greater sense of accomplishment. Oh, look at me, I'm in parliament.
Yeah.
Okay, that feels good, but what would we achieve? Okay.
Like the fraud squad, or when a party like Podemos gets into power in Spain with several seats, doesn't change at all the system.
No. So we recognize the system is destructive. We want to change the system. And we see today we have an opportunity to do that, because the political leaders, all the sectarian political leaders, with no exception, all of them, it's not that they are unintelligent. It's that they are by design incompetent. They cannot get the country out of this bankruptcy. They cannot get the country out of this situation. They can only lead us further into destruction. And what they've been talking about for a while right now is further privatization. They're talking about letting go of our port that was destroyed in August of last year and having the Germans rebuild it, which means to privatize it to the Germans. And this is one of our main ways of, it's a national treasure. You don't give up your ports, okay? So what are they doing? Continuing to sell what remains of the country as if it were a company facing bankruptcy. So we understand they do not have the insight, the knowledge, or the courage to lead this country forward. We do, and many others like us do in the country, and this is what we are pushing for. A transitional government of experts, of knowledgeable individuals, of proud individuals, and of free individuals.
Then just a quick follow-up before I get to my last question, and then we can finally open it up to the audience. Then is it safe to say then that that your political party, yes, if an election was to happen tomorrow, federally or locally. Yes, it would be wonderful if everybody voted for for your parties, because A, you guys aren't sectarian. You guys don't even identify yourself as Maronite Christian first, and then Lebanese second, Shia Muslim first, and then Lebanese second. You see yourselves as Lebanese. And so even though it would be wonderful if everyone voted for your political party, so you can enact all of the revolutionary changes that Lebanon needs, it's your party is more about completely transforming even what the Lebanese people think of themselves in Lebanon, and therefore building a nationwide movement to radically change the broken system in Lebanon. Is it safe to say that?
Yes and no, because you presented a binary that I wish it were true. I mean, I wish that we could win the elections. If we could win the elections, if they were to happen, big if, because I don't think there will be elections next year. Okay. Those who win elections around the world are those who have the most money and the most organization. Those who are the strongest organizationally, and those who are the most funded and who have the most mainstream support. Okay. If you think about the United States, the big individual that was running, that was best for the United States, was Bernie Sanders. There's no question. And yet Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination. Joe Biden, okay, why? Because he had the support of the mainstream media, he had the support of the establishment, okay? We can take that further in the United States and examine who then voted, and we know by what's happening in Georgia and the United States, the importance of electoral laws to push certain people to vote and to push other people not to vote. Same in Lebanon. It's the same situation in Lebanon. We have electoral laws that are designed from the start to get a particular conclusion. The electoral laws in Lebanon are extraordinarily sectarian. And not only do they design electoral laws, they also design electoral municipalities. I mean, the Lebanese past government took gerrymandering to a whole new stage. They would make the North Carolinians really blush with envy at the level of gerrymandering that they did in Lebanon. So by understanding that even if there were to be elections, we can pretty much say from now who will win. That there will be two main political parties that would win, and it would be Hezbollah and the Lebanese forces, because these are the two most organized political parties, and these are the two that won the most in 2018 when the majority of the Lebanese voted. Now, if we assume that by some miracle we would run and we would win the majority, that would be a different question. But no, we wouldn't. Okay, and no secular party would win anywhere close to a significant minority in the election, not even, okay? So we recognize that from the start. So given that, what can we do? And what we are saying right now is, given the reality of the situation, we are pushing for negotiations with the sectarian leadership for them to negotiate with us for the peaceful transfer of power towards a transitional government with legislative power. This is what we have been calling for since November 2019, and what we still view as our main way out of this calamity.
I'm not going to ask any follow-up questions. I'm just going to ask, our viewers, and actually, let me just check if somebody shared this on Facebook, because maybe people asked questions there. Okay. All right. So then. I won't ask any follow-up questions. I'll ask the audience again. Just type into the chat box, and then you can ask any question to Rania. But we got one question, which is there any news about ongoing efforts to coalesce with other similar opposition parties to form a strong front and force transition peacefully into the new government? Thank you for a great discussion. And that was by VLGS 88.
Yes. So thank you for that question. Is there any news about ongoing efforts to coalesce with other similar opposition parties to form a strong front and force transition peacefully into the new government? We have been working on that since November 2019. We are still working on that. And one of our main challenges here is that many other opposition political parties in Lebanon put their hopes in the election. they put their hopes in running for a parliament if we are to have elections. And that this is why I think it's so important. If we consider elections to be transformational, then it would change the alliances that would be built. Because if I'm going to have an alliance for an election, that is a very different kind of alliance than one that I would be making for a political front to put pressure on the current sectarian leaders. And I can give you many examples of this. For example, our position with regards to Hezbollah and with regards to disarming Hezbollah is one that certain opposition political parties in Lebanon don't feel comfortable with. Because our position is, yes, we believe that the state should be the main purveyor of the weapons. It should be the main defender of the country. But that does not mean that we demand Hezbollah to be disarmed, because one, that is unrealistic. Two, that is impractical. Three, that would open up our defenses to our enemy Israel. Rather, what we call for is negotiations with Hezbollah to integrate them into the army, particularly because we recognize Hezbollah to have not so much the weaponry, but the amazing military experience that we want our army to benefit from. That position is at odds with certain other positions by certain other opposition political parties that would rather have alliances with perhaps right-wing elements so that they can use those alliances for the election. Okay, so I'm just giving you this as an example. We are still working to build efforts to coalesce with other opposition parties. We are ready to meet with every opposition political party in Lebanon and every oppositional group in Lebanon that is in recognition of the need to build a civil state and is recognition of the truth of Israel being our existential enemy. And we will then talk about the details and talk about how to have that transitional government. So we are still in that process of building our country forward.
We did get a second question. This is from Kimita S. Hi, Kim. That's actually my older brother who actually helped me prepare for this live stream 2 days ago. So Kimita S asks, do you have any hope of the EU becoming a more constructive player in the region versus the French contribution, which which you've been explaining, and what role is? That's a really good question. And what role is Turkey playing in all of this?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you separated the European Union from France. The French Macron has been trying to present himself as a smart chess player in the region. I don't think he's been very successful with doing so. He's been trying to present himself as a mediator between the United States and Lebanon, as a middle player, a middleman, so to speak. I'm not sure again if he's been so successful, because he's also holding on to the same sectarian system that has caused this level of destruction. The French also have been the primary godfather of all of the loans, many of the loans that we have gotten. So they have been the main supporter of these loans, which means that they have been the main supporter of the kind of economic collapse that we have now constructed. To separate France from the EU, though, I find to be quite interesting, because, who else is a big player in the European Union? Germany? And the Germans aren't really that much invested in Lebanon. We're a very small chess player. We're a very, very small pawn in the world of chess. We're not really that important for Germany. Iraq would be way more important. Syria would be way more important. And even with that regard, then we have to see, well, who has been imposing sanctions on Syria, and what have been the repercussions of those criminal sanctions on Syria? What have been those repercussions on Lebanon, which have been quite severe? So I do not have any hope of the EU becoming more constructive as a player than France per se, nor do I have any hope that Biden will be more constructive as a player than his previous predecessors, because the US government successfully, since the establishment of the United States on the land of the indigenous communities in this region, has been nothing but destructive throughout the world, and it is not any different right now. So no, I do not have any hope in that. I have hope in my own people, building my own country forward. I have hope in building alliances with other people around the world who are standing in opposition to the remnants of colonialism, and are standing in opposition to the remnants and the strength of economic neoliberalism. I see hope in building an alliance with Progressive International and with Yanis Varoufakis and with Jeremy Corbyn and with the leaders that are coming out of the Bolivian ongoing revolution, because there still is a revolution in Bolivia, I see potential for those alliances much more than I see potential for the European Union and France. And Progressive International has been such a beacon of light and inspiration. I do want to say. With regards to Turkey, Turkey's been playing the same role they have always played. It gets really old-fashioned. Really, we're talking about colonial leaders. Turkey has been number one. Turkey is still occupying Syrian lands. So Turkey's role as an occupier has still been ongoing. They're still occupying Syrian lands, and they're very much invested in continuing to infiltrate, to occupy, to weaken the Syrian state, and to have influences economically and militarily and socially within Syria. And of course, that has repercussions in Lebanon. That has direct and indirect repercussions in Lebanon, most definitely. So Turkey is continuing to play, and I should be very specific, the Turkish government here, of course, not the Turkish people, are continuing to play a very destructive role in the region. I don't think that we can ask any government foreign to Lebanon to play a constructive role in Lebanon. I think we would be asking too much. We are no longer at that kind of a world. Governments get involved in other countries for the benefit of their own perceived economic and military interest. And the sooner that we realize that as a people, as Lebanese, as other people, the sooner that we can then build our defenses for that kind of interference, and the sooner that we can then build relationships according to our own economic and military interest, and see who are our friends and who are our foes, build relationships with them accordingly, and recognize, of course, throughout that we have one enemy, and that is the state of Israel.
Another question is, this is from Mustafa Haj Hassan. I hope I didn't butcher his name. And his question is, while the international negotiations are going on between countries who have influence on Lebanon, do you think this will force a temporary solution in Lebanon that would cut you out of the game? And I guess the you is probably, I guess, your political party, or even Lebanese people who really want a Lebanese solution to the ongoing crisis.
Yes. Thank you, Mustafa, for that question. And thank you, Yuri, for broadening who the U is. So the U is not only MMFD, citizens in a state, but also the U are progressive Lebanese. And yes, I agree with you, Mustafa, definitely. International negotiations that are ongoing between countries definitely have their own interest in mind, which would mean they want to continue to see the sectarian system working in Lebanon. They want to continue to push for further privatization, for further loans in Lebanon. They want to continue to push for further weakening of Lebanon economically, military, politically. And many of them also want to be pushing for the disarmament of Hezbollah to suit Zionist political interest. So yes, they could be forcing the progressive Lebanese out of the game, which then means it becomes all the more important for us as progressive individuals, be as Lebanese or be as supporters of progressive Lebanese, to build alliances outside of Lebanon. And this is where the importance of Progressive International comes from. This is where the importance of other progressive individuals in Europe comes in, or the importance of progressives, the remaining progressives in the United States and Canada, that we need that support from others to be able to support our presence in Lebanon so we can defend what remains of our country and build what could be a revolutionary force in the region. I mean, imagine the presence of a civil state in Lebanon that would then kind of reverberate into Jordan, reverberate into Syria, reverberate into Iraq, spread throughout the region, a country that is truly built on egalitarian political principles, that is truly built on protective economic principles, a country that could truly be a stable force where we would no longer be forced to export our youth, but could actually be exporting something good, like, hash.
Yeah. I definitely support that as a guy who wants to enter the drug war. So Anis Germany, or Anis Germany, I hope I'm not mispronouncing it.
Yeah, Anis Germany, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So her question is, how does your political her question is, how does your political program perceive Syrian and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon? Do they have a part to play in solving the crisis? or are they causing it? That's a very good question.
Anis, thank you so much for this question. Do Syrian Palestinian refugees have a part to play in solving the crisis, or are they causing it? I'm going to respond as a devil's advocate first. There are many in Lebanon who claim that Palestinian refugees, have been one of the causes of the violence in Lebanon. They have been one of the causes of the civil war. If they could just go home, we hear that a lot. And of course, it's the dream of every single Palestinian to return to their homes. And by the way, and I do want to make this clear, there is space for them within 1948 Palestine. There is physical space for each and every Palestinian refugee to return to their homes. The only reason they are not allowed to return to their homes is because they are not Jews. That is it. That is the only reason. But there is physical space for them back in their homes. Same when we look at Syrian refugees, one of the constant claims in Lebanon is, and remind me if this sounds familiar to Americans, is, the Syrians came and they took our jobs away. And they made the wages even lower, because now you have the Lebanese employer choosing to hire a Syrian rather than hiring a Lebanese. And you see, it's all the Syrians' fault. Okay. So you have this paradigm that's presented, of course, as an extraordinarily false paradigm economically and politically and historically. The Syrian and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon have been multiple victims. They have been victims of Zionism in Palestine. They have been victims of a war in Syria. And in Lebanon, they are also victims of a very destructive, racist, neoliberal policy. So do they have a part to play in solving the crisis? Yes, because one, they have been living in Lebanon. We have many Palestinians that have been living in Lebanon since 1948. I would argue that they are as Lebanese as I am.
Yeah.
And here becomes, can we as a political party open our space up to them? And we as a political party, we do welcome non-Lebanese to join our political party, because we do recognize that Lebanon can... Wow. Yes, you do not have to be Lebanese to join our political party. You just have to believe in the necessity of a civil state. You do not even have to be in Lebanon to join our political party. We have 25% of our comrades actually live abroad. They are expatriates outside of Lebanon. Our political program definitely views that Lebanon is responsible for the welfare of not only its citizens, but also its residents. So therefore, we consider education to be a right for all in Lebanon, inclusive of residents, therefore most definitely inclusive of Palestinians and Syrians. Okay, we believe that Palestinian refugees should have all economic and political rights in Lebanon, save only the citizenship, because we believe that the Palestinian identity is what is threatened. Therefore, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon will continue to be Palestinians by identity, but beyond that, they will have all other rights as with Lebanese. Same applies to Syrians, except that the Syrian identity is not threatened. So therefore, Syrians could get the Lebanese citizenship if our laws, change accordingly. So once we understand that we do not view them as a problem, we actually view them as victims of a number of situations, okay, then yes, they can be part of the solution. And we do view them as part of the solution, both in terms of the workforce, both in terms of the capabilities that they have to offer, and definitely in terms of the very fabric of the society that we want to be building together.
The next question comes from, and by the way, VLGS88, you're very welcome. He was saying, thank you, Rania and Yuri. Indeed, we need a progressive coalition in the region. Couldn't agree with that statement more. So while Tar's question is, decision makers for the new government lies clearly in the hands of external countries in the region. That's true because Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchs, I'm sure, also play a very reactionary role in Lebanese affairs. So while is asking, how do you see that those 6 Lebanese leaders will give you transition if they don't hold the decision? I think, I understand this question. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you very much for that question. As we say in Arabic, you put your finger on the wound. Most definitely, we have foreign governments that most definitely have influence over decision-making in Lebanon. They have had significant influence, particularly since 1990. We speak of an SNS in Lebanon, which is Syria, Saudi Arabia, both of whom have had significant influence in the formation of governments, in the formation or non-formation of alliances, so on and so forth. So yes, I am in complete agreement with you as to their influence internally. So then how do we see our ability to influence the 6 Lebanese sectarian leaders, and how much do those 6 sectarian leaders actually have the ability themselves? And I think there's 3 folds to that question. There's many folds to that question. One, yes, the sectarian leaders in Lebanon have as much power as they choose to have. And I think this is already quite a revolutionary statement. If I consider myself to be beholden to the Saudis or beholden to the Iranians, then I will behave as their chess pawn, and I will continue to behave as their chess pawn. If I feel that, or if I recognize that by being beholden to them, I am being weaker and weaker internally, that the community that I claim to support internally in Lebanon, I can no longer support, that my own ability to maintain my political leadership is threatened because I no longer have the ability to support my alleged community. And because I see, for example, with regards to Hezbollah, that my weapons may be threatened, that I could see with regards to other sectarian leaders that my very validity in the country could be threatened, that the very existence of my political power could be threatened, then I do have that choice. I can seize that power and tell the foreign sponsors, no, I will no longer be your chess pawn, because the cost of being your chess pawn is higher than the benefit that you give me. They do have that ability. They firmly do. Once they realize that they are no longer, once they free themselves, and freedom becomes 2 parts. It's a decision to be free, and it's the ability to be free. And they can seize that decision once they realize that the risks to continuing to being chess pawns are greater than the benefits. And this is where I think we are today. I firmly believe this is where we are today, that all of these 6 political sectarian leaders today have more to lose than they have to gain. And of course, those of them that have the most to lose are those of them who are the strongest. And they are the ones right now that need to liberate themselves from their foreign sponsors, so they can then sit with us on that negotiating table and be able to recognize that they cannot lead the country forward. Let them step aside for a little bit and hand the reins to those that can lead the country forward. And this becomes then the second question that's implicit in your first question, which is, well, how do we do that to them? I mean, who are we? We are a small political party in Lebanon. Very small, very young. We do not have any military means, and we refuse to carry weapons against our brethren. We absolutely refuse to do that, just as we refuse to be beholden to foreign sponsors. So we refuse to come and be supported by the U.S. Eisenhower, as others were supported by the U.S. Eisenhower in Lebanon. Okay, so what can we provide? What do we bring to the negotiating table for these 6 sectarian leaders who right now are the weakest that they have ever been since the reign in the early 90s? What we bring to them is our willingness to handle the crisis that they created. We are willing to handle the crisis that they created. So we are willing to tell them, step aside for a little bit. Let us be responsible for this crisis. We will not take them to court. We will not, seek revenge against the crimes that they have participated in, either directly or indirectly, because we think it is much more important to, turn off the fire than to apprehend the arsonist. Because it's much more important to protect our country than it is to seize the criminal. Okay, so this is one thing that we are granting them, is we will not be holding them criminally accountable. We will be taking the political and economic responsibility. And at the end of our reign in 18 months, they are definitely welcome to join in elections and to see if the people want them to regain power. And who knows, maybe after 18 months, they will regain power. We do not seek to remove them from the Lebanese landscape because they are part of this country. We seek, though, to build a civil state that will eventually, hopefully, remove them politically from the landscape, that the people themselves will realize that they cannot coexist along with sectarian leaders, that we need to be seeing them within their political lens, not their sectarian lens. It is a very difficult prospect that we are making. We are asked all the time, what is the possibility that we would succeed? And we can argue the possibility is low, but the possibility for every single abolitionist movement always was low, and that was never a reason to falter in the struggle.
If people want to still ask questions, we still have some time. So folks, if you're watching, and even people who've already asked questions, I'm perfectly fine with people asking second questions. I'll just ask a quick question, which is I wanted to ask, what was Syria? What's the Syria connection in the Lebanese Civil War, and why was Syria's military in Lebanon until of course the murder of Rafi Hariri and them being accused of part of it forced them to leave the country?
Yes, in one way, when the Syrian military entered into Lebanon, they had an opportunity to have the Lebanese recognize our shared history and our shared culture with the Syrian people, but they failed to
explain that actually because I remember in an interview on Reality Asserts Itself with The Real News, you actually explained how actually Syria and Lebanon once upon a time was actually one country, but colonialism was what's...
Well, again, if we recognize that the borders of Lebanon weren't created over geographic means, they were created simply to create a demographic majority of one particular, religious sect, then we see, but wait a second, what does this mean for the state of Lebanon and the state of Syria? And I constantly think about my own grandfather who immigrated to Virginia in 1910, 1920. And when he applied for citizenship in Virginia, in the United States, not in Virginia, when he applied for citizenship, on the certificate, when they asked him, where's he from? He said, Syria. And my grandfather is from central Lebanon. He's from one of the mountainous villages in central Lebanon. He then decided, fortunately, to return to Lebanon, and he participated in the armed revolution against the French and was sentenced to death by the French for participating in the armed revolt. And I'm extraordinarily proud of my grandfather, as you can tell. But even so, when we look historically, here's a man who, if you look at his village right now on the map of Lebanon, it's in the geographical heart of the country. And in 1920, that was Syria. Okay, so if when you think about people being separated, people are united by their history, by their culture, by their cuisine, by their language, by all of these things. And we have that same relationship between Lebanese and Syrians and Palestinians and others in the region. So here, when we go back to your question as to the Syrian military, was invited by certain, so to speak, Christian leaders, quote unquote, leaders within the Christian militias, because they saw that they were losing in the sectarian war in Lebanon, and they invited the Syrian army to come in and to support them. And were
they left-wing factions compared to the right-wing faction that murdered the Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila?
No, the ones that invited the Syrians originally were no left-wing factions. They were quite definitely, so to speak, right-wing factions. Although I have problematics with the term right-wing and left-wing because it is extraordinarily simplistic to what has happened, in Lebanon and elsewhere in the world. But the point is, the Syrian military entered Lebanon, and rather than acting to stop the war, what they did for the time period that they were there was ensure that there would be no victor. So whenever they saw, if you remember that game we used to play as children, when you've got those heads that pop up and you're supposed to hit them down. That was what the Syrian army did. Oh, you got to be stronger. They pump you down, and then somebody else, and they pump them down. So this was the game. So that the Syrian military can continue, Syrian government via the Syrian military can continue to control Lebanon, and they continued to, for a very long time, to have this control over Lebanon, until their removal in 2005. So the war ended in 1991, and then the Syrian government was acting more as a referee in Lebanon until their removal in 2005. So unfortunately, they did not play a positive role in the country, neither economically, nor politically, nor militarily. They played like, a foreign influencer, rather than looking at it as, wait a second, we were brothers just 2 days ago. Let's see how we can work together. But no, they did not play that role. But now when we look at it, now the big question becomes, okay, where do we go forward as Lebanese? And now, if you can imagine, we've had successive governments in Lebanon who have chosen the path of, so to speak, neutrality, which is we do not take a position.
Yeah.
This is the official position of so many Lebanese governments, that we do not take a position. So we don't.
In respect to the Western Gulf Israeli war.
In respect to anything. No, we are enemies with Israel officially. There's no question. But what is our position with regards to the Syrian war? We have no position. What is our position with regards to the US sanctions on Syria, the US Caesar Act? What is our position with regards to anything that happens in foreign policy? Our official position is we abstain from taking a position, because going back to the foreign sponsors of the sectarian leaders themselves have different positions. So therefore, the sectarian leaders in Lebanon cannot take a national position because they do not represent the country nationally. Okay, so then that opens up the crisis. Well, today, where can we go forward? If we want to transform Lebanon's economy from one that is consumptive to one that is productive, if we want to be somewhat less food insecure, and we want to develop our agricultural sovereignty in Lebanon, our food sovereignty in Lebanon, okay? If we want to develop our electricity in Lebanon so that we are no longer so dependent on fossil fuel, but we want to be dependent on solar power and wind power, all of these things would require us to build relationships with the Syrian state. We would be required to do so because of our geography, because of our makeup. And so here, therefore, for Lebanese interest, we need to stand against the US sanctions on Syria. We need to stand against the US Caesar Act on Syria. And we need to be building governmental relationships between an independent, courageous Lebanese government and the Syrian government, irrespective of what we may think about the Syrian leadership. This is to the benefit of Lebanon. And of course, it would be to the benefit of the Syrian people. So yes, to answer your question, Anis, that you posed on the chat, do you think Lebanon and Syria can overcome their crisis together? I would argue it is only together that we can overcome our crisis. Lebanon can only overcome its crisis together with Syria. We cannot be able to develop an economic strength agriculturally. Definitely, we cannot do that without Syria. I mean, when you think about it geographically, Lebanon has the sea on one side, and the vast majority of our land borders Syria. So imagine if you want to sell agricultural produce, you need to be developing relationships with Syria, and so many other examples. So yes, we can overcome our crisis economically, but only with the Syrian government, hand in hand. So.
Do you want to respond to the comment VLS 88 said, which is that's right. It's a risk-benefit analysis. That's why, from my view, a strong internal coalition is almost inevitably dynamic in order to have a chance of tilting the scales come tipping points. Would you like to respond to that comment?
Yes, I completely agree that we need to have a strong internal coalition in Lebanon. I completely agree with that we need to be developing a political front in Lebanon. We need to be developing alliances with others in Lebanon who agree with our political perspective, who agree with our the reality as we see it, most definitely. And to be supported by our allies overseas, to be supported by individuals overseas who recognize the magnificent benefit of building a civil state in Lebanon, and the contagion that could have for the region, and the contagion that can have throughout the world. And there's so many examples of beautiful countries that have done magnificent work internationally. That yes, we can and we need to be developing those alliances internally, and we definitely need to be developing those alliances internationally. So here I am extending my hand for all progressives around the world. If you do want to support our vision of a civil state in Lebanon, if you do want to support our vision of a egalitarian, strong state in Lebanon, grounded on equality, grounded on justice, grounded on separation of religion from state, recognizing the dangers of Zionism to Lebanon, to the region, and to the world, then please stand with us and support us in this work together.
Rania, how much more time do I have with you?
I can talk with you for hours. So if you have any other questions, please do let me know.
Okay, perfect. Because there are three questions three follow-up questions I wanted to ask you, which is which is so the Lebanese military itself has never so the Lebanese military is not involved in the Syrian Civil War. It wasn't involved in the invasion of Iraq. The Lebanese military just, I guess it's supposed to defend Lebanon's borders, but it hasn't. This is where
sometimes it has. Again, I'm not going to deprive the Lebanese army of all of its, it has participated in the defense of Lebanese territory against ISIS, for example. It participated with Hezbollah in the liberation of Lebanese lands from ISIS. It also participated, again, with other national resistance fronts in numerous times against Israeli occupation and Israeli aggression. But it simply does not have the training and the military power that others in Lebanon do. So just to recognize, but most definitely, it has never gone beyond the borders of Lebanon. So then
the follow-up question then, when it comes to Hezbollah, is why did Hezbollah decide to join the why did Hezbollah decide to join to defend the sovereign government of Assad in Syria and fight the Western Gulf Israeli-backed forces in Syria?
Okay, well, again, to make it clear, I'm not a spokesperson for Hezbollah. I have numerous different political perspectives than Hezbollah, but according to the statements issued by Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, and according to their actions, they have two perspectives. One is the official and one is the unofficial perspective. The official perspective is that they are not defending the Syrian government. The official perspective is they are defending Lebanon from ISIS, because ISIS at one time had occupied up to 20% of the Lebanese territory. So the official perspective of Hezbollah was they had to support the Syrian government in its fight against ISIS in order to protect the Lebanese territories and the Lebanese population from the potential of ISIS getting stronger. And again, keeping in perspective that there was a time when ISIS did occupy up to 20% of Lebanese territory. So that's the official story.
When did that happen? I wasn't familiar with that. I knew ISIS attacked a neighborhood in Lebanon, but I didn't know that ISIS actually occupied parts of Lebanon.
Yes, well, I mean, there was. You got me on the spot. I'm trying to remember the particular year of the liberation from ISIS. I would ask any of my friends that are watching to remind me of that particular year when Lebanon was officially liberated from ISIS. But we're talking about it as I wish I had a map up here to show you, but. When we had, so you have the Zionist state that was occupying south of Lebanon, but you had ISIS that came in from the east and had somewhat of northern territories, so eastern and northern territories of Lebanon, primarily agricultural lands. And yes, they had significant impacts on agriculture, significant impacts on orchards, and significant impacts on numerous villages along the Lebanese-Syrian border, so that they were, in fact, occupying 20% of the Lebanese territory alongside the Syrian border. So that becomes one of the official reasons that Hezbollah gave. Unofficially, of course, it becomes perfectly natural and expected to have Hezbollah support the Syrian government, given that the Syrian government has been the diplomatic and economic and sometimes the military backbone for Hezbollah. So in a way, that becomes a natural alliance for Hezbollah to support the Syrian government on that perspective. So a lot of that has to do with how we envision the war on Syria, how we envision what was happening in Syria. But those were the reasons that Hezbollah was involved. And it is an involvement that, of course, has been extraordinarily divisive in Lebanon and beyond. And it's also an involvement that we have to recognize that Hezbollah is not the only Lebanese political party to be involved in Syria. There's another political party in Lebanon that has been involved in Syria, which is the so-called Future Movement, led by the Hariris. And their involvement is to support those who have been in opposition of the Syrian government, particularly those allied with ISIS. So here you have
because that's where and that's actually what I also wanted to get at, is that ISIS itself was not a homegrown movement in Iraq and Syria. Of course there are ultra Wahhabi Sunni elements in those nations, as there is across the Middle East, but ISIS itself was exported. Al-Nusra itself was exported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and other actors who want to see the Assad government ousted in Syria, right?
Yes, there were definitely foreign influences. There were definitely foreign influences in supporting ISIS and supporting other extraordinarily destructive elements. I refuse to call ISIS an Islamic movement because in no way are they representative of the teachings of Quran. But it wasn't just Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but ISIS also got a lot of support from Israel. And of course, they got a lot of support from the US governments. And I say governments in plural. And I was just reminded of the liberation and the liberation of Lebanese lands from ISIS actually took place in August 2017, which is what Hezbollah considers the second liberation of Lebanon, with the first liberation being in May 2000 from, with the majority of Lebanese lands being liberated from Israel, and then August 2017, the liberation of Lebanese lands from ISIS. So yes, there are numerous external factors for the development of these extremely problematic organizations. But at the same time, and I think this is necessary for us to recognize that there are also local factors that allow for these organizations to take place, and that they happen when you have an increase of economic poverty, an increase of economic violence. They happen when you have a variety of neoliberal economic plans, and they also happen when you have a massive discrepancy between rural communities and urban communities. So you have various kinds of political and economic and social inequities, and these then create a fertile ground for external influences that can then push particular destructive elements. So there is the local responsibility to these factors, as well as, of course, there is the external responsibility for these factors.
And then a follow-up I wanted to ask about Hezbollah is Hezbollah. I was always quite I decided to do kind of like my own kind of independent research on Hezbollah, and it's important to know that ISIS and all of the other renamed groups that that's associated with the same goals as ISIS, they're of a Wahhabist Wahhabist background, so a sort of ultra Sunni sectarianism, right? And Hezbollah is sort of an ultra Shia persuasion, right?
Officially, yes, they represent different sects of Islam, and I say represent very loosely. But again, I would rather venture away from Quranic readings of them, because if we are going to go back to the text, then we may differ with a great deal of them. It would be the same as to when we look at, so to speak, Christian factions. And if we call them as Christian factions, then I'm sure many of us who are students of the New Testament would take fault with relating to them as Christian factions. So we have the names that people give themselves associated with their religious identities. And I separate that very much from the religious teachings themselves, that come from these books. And a lot of that has to do with interpretation. We can argue the same thing about leftist doctrine. We can argue the same thing, So I just try to stay away from that kind of Sunni versus Shia, because it is a dynamic that has also been greatly magnified and created by the West. We did not have the Sunni Shia dynamic in the region. Arguably until 2005, 2006, we didn't have this dialogue. We didn't have this presentation. It wasn't present. It wasn't even discussed. There wasn't this relationship. It was another construction of the West, another construction of those who want to show a fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so on and so forth. And we have swallowed it whole, just as we have swallowed whole the idea that Lebanon is 18 communities that coexist together, when we are not communities. We are Lebanese, and our communities have to do with our politics. Our communities have to do with our geographical region. Our communities have to do with, our urban domiciles, but it does not have to do with the way we choose or choose not to worship God.
Before I get to Anis's question, then one last follow-up then I wanted to ask about Hezbollah is because I was reading on, I know we shouldn't read, I know we shouldn't be educated on Wikipedia, but sorry guys, I'm a college dropout, so I read stuff on Wikipedia. And on Wikipedia, when I was reading about the ideology of Hezbollah, which if anyone actually wants to understand Hezbollah, please go to that link, or and I'm also going to recommend a professor Professor Saad. She's also fantastic on all things Hezbollah. But when I was reading about the ideology of Hezbollah, it sounds to me as if Hezbollah, is it safe to describe them as a Lebanese Shia nationalist movement? Because a lot of their texts and their manifestos, they talk about actually uniting all Lebanese and getting all foreign influence out of Lebanon, and Zionism is part of that. And that goes back to the answers you gave me when I talked about Israel's involvement in the Lebanese Civil War. Is that a fair assessment to make about Hezbollah? Which is why they do appeal to so many people, even if they're not of a conservative Shia background.
I think the term Shia nationalism becomes a contradiction in terms, because at the moment we identify a religious identity with a nation, then we deny that nation a nationalist identity. And we deny the identity of all those who do not subscribe to that religious identity. So that in and of itself is problematic. And this is my main disagreement with Hezbollah, that they are not only a sectarian political party, but a religious sectarian political party. Had they been developed to be truly nationalist, to be truly a leftist, progressive, anti-imperialist, nationalist force, not a sectarian religious force, then they would have had the power to unify so many more people behind them, and they would have had the power to actually build a country forward. However, they were, for various reasons, they were developed as a sectarian religious party. Consequently, it led to the kind of economic divisions that they supported. It led to a failure to support unions. It led to a failure to support universal healthcare. It led to a failure to support strong and public education for all. It led to a failure even to support national agricultural policies that are farmer friendly. And I could go on and on and on.
Which ironically would help out the very communities they claim to represent.
Exactly. All of these things would help out.
Not just their Shia communities, but all of the Lebanese that they claim they're fighting for when they fight against foreign influence in Israel, right?
Yes. They have done something remarkable that I always recognize, which is they were the primary player in the defense and liberation of the Lebanese lands. Not the only player, mind you, not the first player, not the only ones to sacrifice their lives, but they became the primary ones, and we all owe them a debt of gratitude in that liberation. However, that does not excuse their national policies. One does not excuse the other. So I am in support of the resistance, but even when we think about resistance, the mere fact that we have a resistance means we have the failure of the state to act. I want to participate in the joy of defending my land. I want to participate in carrying that honor and say that I am part of the defense, the military defense of my land. I cannot do that because, the Lebanese army is not equipped. And of course, I cannot join Hezbollah, not simply because I'm a woman, but also because I am not of the right sectarian persuasion. Not forget the fact that I'm way too old. That becomes another discussion. Okay, but here, imagine if we had a national policy of defense. Imagine if we had a national recognition of Israel being an enemy. What that would mean for our education system. What that would mean for our environmental policies. What that would mean for our education policies, for our employment policies, for our defense policies. All of these things would need to change. It is no light thing to say that we are at war, that we have an enemy. Very few countries around the world state that they are at war and they have an enemy. We do not have a foe. We have an enemy, an existential threat to our existence. We need to take that seriously, which means we cannot leave that solely to the responsibility of one group of Lebanese to defend our country. It must be the responsibility of all Lebanese. It must be the responsibility of all the Lebanese institutions, of everyone for generations to come until we are able to defeat Zionism.
I'm going to actually, I have a follow-up then to ask about that. Sorry, Anise, I promise I'll get to your questions soon. But then, Okay, so when talking about Israel, when talking about Israel, and Israel is only getting more and more and more ultra-Zionist as the years go on. Even if Netanyahu wasn't against the power, oh my gosh,
Yes.
He's a rival ultra-Zionist and also a rival oligarch competing against other ones.
Yes.
So that being said, and the reason why you keep emphasizing that Israel is an enemy of Lebanon is because of the Greater Israel project, as well as solidarity for the Palestinians. So that being said, aren't we seeing the end of Palestine as we know it, because Israel is going to fully annex the West Bank, even though they've claimed to have given nationhood back to Palestinians in Gaza? Gaza is under an economic blockade, and given the fact that somebody like Jeremy Corbyn was destroyed because of the Israel lobby, because of Israel meddling in in UK affairs, and given the fact that even under Jeremy Corbyn, who was a lifelong ally to the Palestinians, he threw a lot of his comrades, most of them Jewish anti-Zionists, under the bus when he didn't call, pardon my language, when he didn't call bullshit on the smear campaign against him. And many of his leadership also did the same thing, because they just threw Palestine under the bus, or they simply all exposed themselves as being progressive on everything except Palestine. So all of that being said, and of course we have countries adopting the IHRA definition. So all that being said, is there really no hope of for the Palestinians, and that we are going to see the completion of the Zionist project due to all of that?
So many different questions. I'm going to start with Jeremy Corbyn and work my way to Palestine. Jeremy Corbyn was defeated because he chose the weak route. He chose to appease those who slandered him rather than to stand in their face. And I think what happened to Jeremy Corbyn is a lesson for everyone around the world. The moment we bow our head 1 inch for those who want to slander us, our neck gets cut. The only way to stand in opposition, to stand in defiance, is to stand in defiance. Jeremy Corbyn thought that if he lowered his head a little bit, he could pass. And of course, they saw his act for a weakness. And what you do with weakness is you cut off their heads. Okay. Yeah. And as a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, it broke my heart that he did what he did, because he should have taken the route of strength. This applies throughout. We see it in the United States with Alexandria Orquez, AOC in New York, who began her congressional career as a supporter of Palestinian rights and now has been pandering the Israeli lobby and speaking in support of Israel in a very disgusting tone. No way can anyone be considered to be progressive if you do not walk the talk on Palestine. There is no such thing as progressive except Palestine. I cannot be, racist except, there is no, you're either progressive, inclusive of Palestine, or you're not, period. It's across the board. So I just want to say that about Jeremy Corbyn. It serves as a great lesson for us all. Now, with regards to Palestine, there was never any hope, so to speak, for a two-state solution. From the moment of the Oslo Accords, and I consider the Oslo Accords to be of an equivalent catastrophe as the catastrophe of 1948 that we call the Nakba. The Oslo Accords were of equivalence to the Nakba of 1948. There was never any possibility of a two-state solution from the Oslo Accords and working our way forward, okay? Even if we are going to forego that the two-state solution is built on apartheid, the two-state solution is built on racism, the idea that I cannot live beside you because you are not Jewish is the very definition of supremacy and racism. Okay, the two-state solution that was saying we'll give the Palestinians 22% of their homeland, and that should be enough because, oh, God forbid I live beside one, because that would alter the demographics of the state of Israel. But even the fine print of the Oslo Accord made it very clear that the two-state solution would never see the light. So in many ways, what has happened by these ultra-Zionists is they themselves have killed the two-state solution, which means that the only way forward is the one-state solution. The only way forward is the one-state solution. And here we can learn from the struggle in South Africa, where we have an example in South Africa of a colonialization and an occupation built on supremacy, okay? And that was politically defeated, not economically defeated, but politically defeated through a national armed struggle. Let us not forget that the ANC in South Africa carried weapons and sacrificed their lives. And it was a beautiful armed struggle in South Africa, supported by an international boycott movement, a boycott movement that said, we refuse to sit alongside anyone representing the South African government, even if they simply want to dance or to run or to participate in sports. We will isolate them because we consider apartheid to be repulsive. It was those two actions that led to the dismantlement of the political apartheid system. South Africa still has a long way to go because they still need to dismantle economic apartheid, but it was a step forward. What we are calling for in the occupied land of Palestine throughout is the same. We want the dismantlement of apartheid. The political apartheid system of Zionism needs to be dismantled. We need to have the right of return of each and every Palestinian, which, as Salman Abu Sitta presents academically, each and every Palestinian with their descendants can return back to their original villages. The only reason they are not allowed to return is because of racism, is because of Jewish supremacy, is because of apartheid. So we cannot be in support of equality and be in support of Zionism. It does not work. It simply doesn't work.
And
my very last thing that I want to say is I find the question of hope to be problematic. Because if I'm going to say, is there hope in the Palestinian liberation? And if I tell you there's no hope, what are you going to do then? So I find the question to be problematic because rather than saying, is there hope? The question should be, how do I build the hope? How do I strengthen the Palestinian liberation movement? How do I weaken Zionism? How do I build equality? Not is there, but how can I participate in that movement? That becomes the question.
And then my last follow up before we get to Anis's question, and I think that would be probably a good note to end is okay. I'll present the Israeli point of view, which I'm sure a lot of my Likud supporting friends or Zionist friends would say to you and me, because I'm sure they're pissed off right now with all the Israel bashing in this conversation. I'm sure we're probably even considered anti-Semites if we all adopt the IHRA definition.
Well, I am a Semite, and I'm not a self-hating person, so
Okay, so the Israeli point of view would say this, and a supporter of Israel would say this. Rania, I do want peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I would love to embrace your democratic, secular, one-state solution. But when we gave nationhood back to the Palestinians, when we gave them back Gaza, they voted for Hamas, which wants to wipe us out. And Hezbollah wants to wipe us out. And your people aren't doing anything to stop the Hamas of the world and the Ayatollah Khomeinis of the world and the Hezbollahs of the world from wanting to wipe us out. So therefore, we have to keep voting for Bibi Netanyahu. We have to keep voting for anyone who wants the status quo because we tried your experiment in Gaza, and look, they gave us they gave us Hamas, and that's why we have an economic blockade on them. So how would you respond to my Israeli friends or ex-Israeli friends on?
I find it hilarious that the assumption within that statement is I will support democracy so long as you vote for who I want you to vote for, which is the implication behind that. How dare you vote for someone I don't want when I allowed you the right to vote? How dare you do that? So setting that aside, okay. One, when they claim that Hamas wants to wipe us out, let us define who us is. Palestinians and Lebanese and anyone else has the right to call for the dismantling of Zionism. Okay, we have the right to do that. If Zionists view that as wiping them out, so be it. So be it. The abolitionists that fought against slavery, if the slave owners said, you want to wipe us out? Yeah, we do want to wipe out your way of life. We have no problem with that. The fighters in South Africa did want to wipe out the way of life of the apartheid supporters. There's no problem with that, okay? So yes, Israel does not have a right to exist. No state per se has a right to exist. People have a right to exist. People have a right to exist under equality, under liberty, with dignity, but not states per se. States come and go. Now, you take that further. A Zionist state that is built on supremacy has absolutely no right to exist. Absolutely no right to exist. So am I called by saying, though, do I want to wipe them out? If they support Zionism, I want to wipe out that ideology. Does that mean I want to throw them into the sea? No. There has never been an Arab leader who has said, we want to throw the Jews into the sea. We've been accused of making that statement, but they cannot find evidence to that. We've never said that. And you're
an Arabic speaker, so yeah.
As an environmentalist, I don't want to throw anything into the sea, but that becomes another issue. So no, absolutely, Hamas, Hezbollah, no other organization in the region that I know of has actually called for the wiping out of Jews or the wiping out of individuals, but have called for the wiping out of a supremacist ideology, which is their right. Now, if we're going to take that to the next level, which is that economic blockade was enforced on Gaza because of the support for Hamas, well, we can debate that politically and historically, and it's not quite accurate. But again, it boils down to the concept that you had the audacity to vote for a political party that was demanding your liberation. Of course, I am going to work to weaken you, which is why, you chose not to vote for Fatah that supported the Oslo Accords, that supported your slavery under an economic system that would break you. How dare you call for your liberation? Isn't that what they're saying? Yes, we have the right to call for our liberation. We have the right to live with dignity. We have the right to refuse to negotiate with the sword. We have the right to want to live as equals on the land that is our own and has been our own for centuries. Now, the other reason that Israelis respond is, you're asking too much, and you need to be realistic. And I always find it to be extremely problematic when the privileged demand for the oppressed to be realistic. It is realism that keeps us oppressed. So no, the oppressed do not want to be realistic. The oppressed need to be revolutionary and transformative. And the privileged need to realize that if they want to be able to live with any kind of dignity, with any kind of sense of conscience, if they want to live a life that they can be proud of, that they have to relinquish their privilege and live as equals. Because so long as they will be living as oppressors, there will be people who are oppressed who will be fighting against them. That is the guarantee of human history. That is what is very, very clear. So Zionism continues to present its raison d'etre because they want to live within an apartheid system. And I will not make excuses for an apartheid system. Similar to how I refuse to make excuses for a system of slavery, I refuse to make excuses for neoliberal economic policies that are predicated on sweatshops. I refuse to make excuses for political apartheid in South Africa. No, all of these are systems that need to be dismantled. Very simple.
And also, very important thing to note. I'm sure my friends in Israel don't, have never gotten this, but actually, Hamas actually called for a 20-year or so ceasefire between Israel. Let's get at the negotiating tables and talk about the right of return and how to radically transform the situation.
Hamas actually agreed to a two-state solution. Hamas went so far as agreeing to a two-state solution. So it's by no sense revolutionary and transformative. But Hamas did what Jeremy Corbyn did. They started to lower their head. And when you start to lower your head, you will get your neck broken.
How do they start to lower their heads?
By agreeing with a two-state solution to begin with.
Oh, okay.
How is a two-state solution anything but a relinquishment of the right to live as equals? It is an acceptance of a supremacist racist ideology. That is what a two-state solution is predicated on. So I am a believer in Ghassan Kanafani's writings. I am a believer in Ghassan Kanafani's ideology, and I encourage people to go back and to read Ghassan Kanafani, a man who was murdered in 1972 and whose writings and teachings continue to reverberate throughout the region and continue to be our icon in identifying ourselves and recognizing what it means to negotiate with an enemy. And again, really, the situation in Palestine is really, really very, very simple. It's an old-fashioned colonialism. And let us remember, do we want to be living as equals? What is the problem of a Jew and a Christian and a Muslim living side by side? That is historically what we in the region have been doing, living side by side, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. There is no problem with that. There is a problem, though, with the New York Jew deciding to go to Jerusalem and to kick out a Palestinian family that has been living in Jerusalem for centuries and to invade their homes, as is happening right now in Jerusalem with the expulsion of more than 50 families in Jerusalem in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. We are seeing this right now happening. We know these families will be expelled from these homes. We have ethnic cleansing that is ongoing. It's happening right now. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, and also another important thing to add, which I find bizarre with Israel and its supporters, is that what do you want the Palestinians to do? Your enemy was Yasser Arafat, who was a secular Arab. I mean, the PLO and Fatah were secular. Yes. And you rejected their olive branches even when they came to the point of, okay, we'll take a two-state solution, and again, this probably is not reported in Israeli news unless it's the occasional inconvenient truth teller. But Hamas actually called for a ceasefire and let's get back to the negotiating table, and we even do accept a two-state solution. So.
But let's look at it this way. Let's look at it this way. How beautiful would it be if we say that there are communities around the world, Jewish communities around the world of, Jewish Americans, Jewish Germans, whatever, from whatever nationalities they may be, and they are in love with the land of Palestine. They feel an emotional connection to this land for whatever reasons that they choose to have. Imagine how beautiful if they were to say, wow, I am going to go and live in this land and live in the spirit of religion, which is the spirit of humility and love and brotherhood, alongside those who have also been living on this land for centuries. And we can live together in peace. It's the very same concept when people migrate to the United States and they choose to live here. They don't kick out people now. I mean, they did centuries ago, but now people come and they live alongside others who have lived here. Why not adopt that revolutionary principle? Why choose to adopt rather a capitalist colonialist model of living only my people and removing the people that live there? I mean, a beautiful country could be in formation. A beautiful system could be in formation if they accept the concept of equality. But if they think that we, the people of the land, will continue to allow our heads to be bowed, then they are vastly mistaken.
And, of course, the BDS movement boycotts, divestment, sanctions on Israel, which was called by Palestinian civil society without exception, a united Palestinian civil society without exception, calls for a democratic, secular, one-state solution. And still, Israel and its supporters say, you're being anti-Semitism, and no. We cannot possibly live side by side in a democratic, secular society. So that's also a very important thing to add when I do come up against, my Israeli friends who, reject a democratic one-state solution or reject the legitimate government of the people of Gaza. Yes. So, final question then. Because it seems as if nobody wants to ask any questions for whatever reason. So the final question, this is from Anis in Germany again, asks Anis Germany or Anis Germany. So
Anis Germany actually, but that's okay. Well, yeah.
My apologies.
No, that's okay.
So the question is, So the question is, in light of talks on a U.S. Green New Deal and European Green New Deal, is there a place for a green transition in a bankrupt country like Lebanon? Perfect question.
Yeah, and it's a perfect way to end this discussion. Thank you, Anis, for that question. And Speaking here as an environmentalist, speaking as a political activist, the way that many of us see this issue is we have an opportunity here. Okay, we have an opportunity to rebuild our economic system and to rebuild our social system in Lebanon. It is only through a green transition that we can do that. And I'll give you so many examples. When I spoke earlier about $3.5 billion are what we need for our fuel, okay, now we no longer have that amount of money. So what do? Well, let us transform our use of fuel. Instead of the way that we use fuel, which is dependent on electricity from fossil fuels and dependent on private transportation, we can transform our electricity model to one that is dependent on solar power and wind power. And we can transform our private transportation to public transportation. So by so doing, we would be doing it for economic reasons because we are bankrupt and we need to save money and we no longer have the money to import. But we would also be moving towards a green transition. So what I'm saying is it is only a green transition that can rescue Lebanon today, whether we look at it from an electricity perspective, we look at it from an agriculture perspective. It's been proven time and time and time again that the agricultural model of efficiency is not a monocultural model. It's a model of hyper-agriculture, of when we have agriculture and ecology working together, when we have multiple stories within agriculture, when we have multiple vegetations that are raised together along with local animals and local varieties. This would create higher efficiency, this would be more economic, and this would reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and this would also cause us to be more resilient for the future climate changes that are already present. I mean, I shouldn't say future climate. We currently are in the climate change, and our region, the Eastern Mediterranean, has already been facing successive years of drought, and the drought will only get worse. So what I am saying is that it is only a green transition that can save Lebanon's economy. It is only a green transition that can take us forward from an electricity perspective, from an agricultural perspective, from the way that we even design our cities and design our villages. And I have to say this also, from the way that we look at each other. We can learn so much from ecology. We can learn so much from non-human animals. We can learn so much from the plants around us. Darwin has been so massively misunderstood. People thought that Darwin spoke about the survival of the fittest. He didn't. He spoke so much more about community and about altruism. We have learned through the study of ecology, we have learned through the study of non-human animals, we have learned through the study of plants that we cannot survive as individuals. We can only survive as communities, whether we are communities of people or communities of people along with other non-human animals and the beautiful local vegetation. And we can learn all this through a spirit that is altogether forgotten in our education system and forgotten by capitalism itself, which is a spirit of humility and awe rather than a spirit of arrogance and greed. And this is what is, I think, the heart of the green transition, if we are to do it properly, not as part of a US Green New Deal, because of course there can be no green transition so long as we are wedded to capitalism. There can be no green transition so long as we accept militarism. Militarism and capitalism and racism are in opposition to any kind of ecological sovereignty, to any kind of an ecological sustainability. That's not what the land teaches us. The land teaches us something else. So we can build that, and we have an opportunity to do so right now in Lebanon. And again, I appeal to all those around the world who are fighters for environmental justice, who are fighters for ecological sovereignty, who are fighters for equality, who are fighters for a different way of living, one of humility and joy instead of arrogance and capitalism, to stand with us in Lebanon and to build this new world together.
Wow, wow. Shot of hope optimism right there. I usually never get that on this show. Well, on that really optimistic note, I don't want to take too much more of Rania's time, and we've actually gone on for 2 hours. So we were joined on this edition, this fantastic All Things Lebanon edition of 1+1 with Rania Masri, who is a Lebanese-American part-time professor of Communications and Environmental Justice. She's also, as you guys can see, is a peace activist, an environmentalist, an eco-socialist, a media critic, and a member of Lebanese political party Citizens in the States. I'm going to post a bunch of important links if people want to continue to enlighten themselves about Lebanon. I'm going to post a bunch of links, including the link to citizens in the States. Rania, I'll talk to. I'll give you a Facebook call, but I'm going to have to end the broadcast. And before I do that, thank you so much for joining me today. This is fantastic. When I first started 1+1, I said to myself, okay, I don't want to just get the very popular names that people the distant voices. I really want to get the criminally underrated truth tellers and mythbusters, which is why I wanted so badly to have Whitney Webb, Eve Angler, and all the Canadian presenters I've had on the show, and of course my friends at the World Socialist website. Yes. You are one of the first people I really wanted to have on the program because of all the fantastic truth telling and myth busting you did. This was a fascinating conversation, and thank you. I finally got to learn about Lebanon.
Thank you so much, Yuri, for the time and for the space and for these questions. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who popped in with a question.
Exactly, and I really hope I really hope we have you back on in the future, because environmentalism. There's so much we can talk about environmentalism. Yes. So I'll definitely have you back on. And before I end the broadcast, Mustafa Haj Hassan says thank you, Rania and Yuri. And Yasha Hurani also says, thank you, Rania. Brilliant. I completely agree with them. So, Rania, I'll give you a Facebook call. But for now, folks, good night and good luck. And Rania, again, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. All the best to you, Yuri. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.